We continue now at the top of Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 24b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara discussed a situation where a woman is a Nazir and she separated animals which would be used for karbanos to be brought at the end of the term of her Nazirus, and then her husband goes ahead and he annuls her vow of Nazirus. And so in this case, the question is, what happens to these animals? And the Mishnah made a distinction between whether the animals belonged to the husband or did the animals belong to the wife. The Mishnah says if the animals belong to the husband, so in that situation there is no Kedusha whatsoever once he annuls the vow. But if the animals belong to the wife, so there is Kedusha, and the animals have to be dealt with, and the Mishnah discussed how the animals are dealt with. And so the Gemara in the previous Amud said that according to the Rabbanan, this Mishnah would not work, because the Rabbanan hold that a husband has no obligations to bring the karbanos on behalf of his wife. And so therefore, if the husband owned the animals and didn't give her any possession over the animals, so she could never sanctify the animals, regardless of whether the vow was annulled or it wasn't annulled. It makes no difference. They're not her animals, and they have no kedusha in any case. So that can't be the situation. And the situation also cannot be that the husband gave the animals over to the wife, because then it would actually be the wife's animals, and therefore it should be treated the same as a situation where she sanctified her own animals, and the kedusha should remain. And that's why the Gemara said that the Mishnah must be following Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that a husband does have a general obligation to bring the karbanos that his wife is obligated in. But the Gemara now says, Rava says, Afilu Teimer Rabbanan. You could even say that our Mishnah follows the Rabbanan. And the case is really where he is giving the animals over to his wife, but he gives it over sort of conditionally. Ki makni lo nami, because when is he being makna to her these animals? B'milsa detzrichola. He's only giving it to her if it's something that's necessary, meaning if she actually needs to bring these karbanos at the completion of her Nazirus. But b'milsa de lo tzrichola, but if it's something that's not necessary, because the Nazirus was annulled, lo makni lo, so he doesn't give it over to her, and that's how you can explain the Mishnah according to the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Im shelo haisa behemta chatos tamus viola tekarev. Let's say the animal that she separated for the karbanos, let's say it's her animal. So the animal that's a chatos, that has to die. The kedusha remains. He can't do anything with it once her vow is annulled. But the karbanola, that can be brought. And the Gemara asks, Himinola, so where does she have any property from? Where does she have these animals under her possession that she's able to be makdish and separate these animals? Isn't there a general rule that whatever the wife acquires is actually acquired by the husband? So where did she get possession of these animals? And the Gemara answers, Amar Papa says, Shekimtsasa meisasa. Case over here is that we know the husband has to provide mazonos for his wife, and let's say she took from that mazonos, but she didn't use it all. She was meager in terms of what she used, and she saved up a little of it, so then that property belongs to her, and that's how she can acquire these animals. If you want, I could say another answer. The akni lo acher, someone else gave her either the money or the animals, v'yamar lo, and said to her, Al menashe lebalech rishus bahen, I'm giving it to you on condition that your husband has no possession over it. That is effective, and that's how she can acquire property. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ha'ola tikrav ola v'hashlamim tikrav v'chulu. Again, talking about a situation where a wife separated animals for the completion of her Nazirus, and then her Nazirus was annulled, so that which was separated as a carbon ola should be brought as a carbon ola. The shlamim can be brought as a carbon shlamim, and the Mishnah said, even though normally a Nazir brings a carbon shlamim along with bread, but in this situation, the bread will not be brought. And the Gemara says, Amar le Shmuel li Avua Barihi. Shmuel said to Avua Barihi, Lo seisav al karech, don't sit on your legs, Ada amrid li hadam milsa, until you explain to me the following. V'elohein arboa elim she'enon te'unin lechem. The following are the 4 rams, talking specifically by Nazirus, which do not require bread. They are the following. Shalo v'shala v'shala achar misa v'shala achar kapora. His, hers, after death, and those that are after atonement. The Gemara says, Shalah hada amran. Shalah, that's what we're referring to in our Mishnah. The case is meaning she separated her own animal for the completion, to be brought at the completion of her Nazirus. And as we said in that case, so let's say her Nazirus is annulled, she brings the animal as a carbon shlamim, but does not bring the bread. Shalah, what's the case referred to as Shalah, his? Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Ha'isha madras beno ben Nazir. A man is allowed to make his son become a Nazir. He can take a vow on behalf of his son, so to speak, to make his son a Nazir. Ve'eno isha maderes es beno ben Nazir. But that's not true by the mother, by the wife. She's not able to make her son into a Nazir. And the Mishnah says, Gilach o shegilchu krovim. Micha osha michu krovim. There's a concept over here that the son is able to reject this nazirus, and he can reject it either by shaving or by protesting. So if he shaves, or if his relatives shave him, or if he protests, or if his relatives protest for him, so in those situations he's no longer a nazir. What's going to happen if he designated money for the karbanos, for the completion of the nazirus? So the Mishnah says, Hayu lo mos stumin. So if he had money that was designated just in general, but wasn't specified for particular karbanos, so yiplu linadava. So then that money is able to be used, donation to the Beis HaMikdash, as a donation to the Beis HaMikdash for communal karbanos. Mos mefurashin. Now let's say he has money and it was designated, this is for the chatos, this is for the ola, etc. So the mechatos yelchu liyam hamelach. The money that was designated for the carbon chatos, that has to be thrown into the yam hamelach. Dmei ola yaviu ola. The money that was designated for the ola can be used for carbon ola. Umoal in bohenin. There would be meila in that situation. If the person uses it for his personal use, that would be a sin of meila. Dmei shlamim yaviu shlamim. And the money for the shlamim, that can be used for carbon shlamim. V'nechad and liyom echad. And again, that shlamim would only be eaten for one day, like the shlamim of a nazir. Ve'enon te'unin lechem. And there's no requirement of bread. So that's the case that we refer to when we talk about the case of shalo. Again, this situation where the person made his son a nazir. What's the case of shala achar misa? What's the case of after death? Minolan, from where do we know that case? The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa. Hamafrish mos lenazirusa. If somebody separates money for his nazirus, so lo nehenin velo moalin bahen, you can't derive benefit and you can't commit meila either with that money. Mipnei shehein ruuyin lahavi bekulan shlamim, because that money that was designated, in theory, it could be used for carbon shlamim. And Rashi says, Hamafrish mos lenaziruso v'hayustumin, meaning the person separated money for the completion of the term of the nazirus for karbanos, but it's stumin, meaning to say, again, he didn't designate what exactly the money would be used for, what kind of karbanos. Lo nenin v'lo moalin bohen, the person's not allowed to benefit for it, but also there's no meila, mimnei shein ru'uyin lahavi bekulan shlamim, because in theory the money might be used for carbon shlamim. Meaning to say, says Rashi, because every single piece of money that was separated, designated, shalahen yachol lahavi ben shlamim, in theory that money might be used for shlamim. Over shlamim amrinan deleka meila lifnei zrikas damim. The halacha by carbon shlamim is there is no meila if you're holding before the sprinkling of the blood. And the Mishnah over here continues. We will note over here, even though it says Detanya, which is usually a brisa, they change it to Detnan. This is actually a Mishnah. In any case, this Mishnah in Meila continues. Mace, let's say the individual dies after he separated the money. V'hayulo mos stumim, and he has money that was designated for karbanos, but not specified which carbon. So again, it says yiplu l'nedava. In that situation, that money is used for donations for communal karbanos to the Beis HaMikdash. Mos mefurash, and if he designated the money for specific karbanos, t'mei chatos yolich liyam hamelech. So the money for the carbon chatos, that goes to the yam hamelech. Lo nenin v'lo moal, and again, person can't benefit, but there is no meila in that case. T'mei ola yaviu ola, the money for the carbon ola, it is used for carbon ola. Umoalin behen, by carbon ola, there is meila. T'mei shlamim yaviu shlamim, the money for shlamim can be used for shlamim. V'nechal liyom echad ve'enon te'unin lechem. And again, this carbon shlamim, since it was originally designated for the shlamim of a nazir, it's eaten for one day, like the shlamim of a nazir, but there's no requirement to bring bread, as there would have been if this would be the carbon shlamim of a nazir. And so that is the case of shala achar misa, where the shlamim does not require bread. And the Gemara continues, Shala achar kapara. What about the case of after kapara? Svarhu, it's logical. Shala achar hamisa, my time. What's the reason by la achar misa why there's no bread? To lo chazi la kapara, because at this point in time the person is not fit for the kapara, because the person is no longer alive. Shala achar kapara nami. So after kapara, also after there's already been an atonement, halo chazi la kapara, the person is no longer fit for a kapara, and so that's why there would be no bread along with the carbon shlamim. And Rashi over here explains, Shala achar kapara, what does it mean after kapara? Shem hivrish behemto v'avda. Let's say, for example, the person would separate an animal and that animal would be lost. Omos v'avdan, or let's say he separates money for the animal, for the carbon, and that's lost. V'hivrish acherem tachtein. So since he lost the money, he now separates a different animal, different money. V'yachar kach nimtzu chatos odemei chatos. Now after that, the chatos is found, or the value of the chatos is found. So in that situation, he's already had a kapara, he's already had an atonement. So then yolech liyam hamelech, so then that will have to go to the yam hamelech. It can't be used anymore. Va'ola tikrav ola, if there's an ola, it can be brought as an ola. Va'shlamim l'shlamim, and again, the shlamim can be brought as marzei shlamim, v'necholim l'yom echad ve'enan tulim lechem. Again, same basic idea. It's eaten the shlamim for one day, and it doesn't require bread. Desvaruhu v'chulu. It's the same logic that we apply to the case of liachar misa. And the Gemara continues, v'su lekar, there are no other cases of the shlamim of a nazir that's brought without the bread. Va'ika, but isn't there the following? The Bach puts in the words, the Tani Levi, because Levi taught, ushar kol shalmei nazir, other kinds of shlamim of the nazir, sheshachtan shalokim mitzvasan, let's say they were shechted, not according to the proper mitzvah. So the halacha is kesherim, they're kosher, v'lo olin l'baylim l'shem chova, but still they can't be used to fulfill the obligation of the owner. V'necholim l'yom echad, they're eaten for one day. V'einon te'unin lo lechem v'lo zroa, and they don't require the bread. So here we see another example where the bread is not required, and also they don't require the foreleg. And the Gemara answers to this, k'mitzvasan kachashiv, shalo k'mitzvasan lo kachashiv. You're right, this is an additional case, but we're only counting the cases where everything was done k'mitzvasan properly, but if it was not done k'mitzvasan, we're not counting such a case. And Rashi says, Ushar kol shalmei nazir le'el ayri b'shlamim. Again, we're talking earlier, right before this, it was discussing carbon shlamim. We're talking about shlamim here. Sheshachtan shalo k'mitzvasan de mitzvasan lahavi ben shtei shanim l'shem shalmei nazir. Because the mitzvah is it has to be a certain age, 2 years. It has to be l'shem shalmei nazir, for the sake of shalmei nazir. If it wasn't done properly, again, so this is the halacha over here. The lechem is not required, and the zroa is not required. Tosas over here says, Ve'ein tunin lo lechem v'lo zroa, hoel ve'ein ha-nazir nitar behen. The point is, since the nazir is not made permitted through such a carbon, so therefore, lekach ein tunin zroa, therefore the foreleg is not required. What's the usual requirement by the zroa? Lehizbashel im ha'ayel v'lasos tenufa. Usually it's cooked together with the ram, and they do waving. And so over here, again, since it's not really being used for to be matir the nazir, so that part is not required. Tosas just points out, our Mishnah also, even though our Mishnah said the bread is not required, it didn't mention anything about the zroa, but really our Mishnah also could have included this line of velo zroa. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Rishonim say the proper girsa here should be v'hayu lo mo stumim. It's talking about the Mishnah in Me'ilah that we quoted above. A person separates some money for his nazirus, and then he dies, and he had money again. It wasn't designated for specific karbanos of the nazirus, so yiplu l'nedava, so that money should be used as donations to the Beis HaMikdash for communal karbanos, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph.